Snow had started falling before dawn, drifting silently over the city like whispers of forgotten lullabies. By midday, the sidewalks had vanished beneath a thick white blanket. Cars crawled along icy streets, their tires sighing against slush, and even the honking horns of impatient drivers had grown muffled under the weight of winter. On the corner of 18th and Willow, three figures moved slowly against the storm. Lula Jackson, 72, wrapped her tattered coat tighter around her frail frame. Her boots, more patches than leather, slipped with every step, but she gritted her teeth and pressed forward. In one hand, she clutched a duffel bag filled with everything they owned. With the other, she held tightly to the small, cold hand of her granddaughter, Naya. 10-year-old Naya said nothing. Her lips were blue, and her breath came in short clouds. Beside her, she held her little brother Malik close, his tiny body wrapped in a faded blanket. He was only 5, and his forehead burned with fever, even as snowflakes clung to his lashes like crystal tears. They had been walking for hours. "This way, baby," Lula whispered, her voice hoarse with exhaustion. "We'll find somewhere." Naya nodded, though she didn't believe it anymore. They had tried the shelter downtown, full. The library, closed for the storm. The church on Grant Street, locked. Behind them, their former apartment had gone dark. The landlord hadn't even waited for the snow to stop before changing the locks. Now the wind was picking up, biting through wool and skin and bone. Malik whimpered. Naya stopped and knelt in the snow, cradling him against her. "Don't sleep, baby," she whispered. "You gotta stay awake." Lula looked up at the sky, gray and endless. Her legs trembled. Her heart, never strong to begin with, thudded unevenly in her chest. She was too old for this, too tired, but she couldn't stop. Just a little longer, she told herself. Just one kind stranger, just one open door. And then, headlights. A sleek black car purred around the corner, silent except for the whisper of tires on snow. It didn't belong here. The streets they walked were for the forgotten. The car was something out of another world. Lula instinctively stepped in front of the children, shielding them. The car slowed, stopped. Behind the tinted window, a man sat alone. For a moment, nothing moved. The snow kept falling. Then the door opened. A tall man in a long wool coat stepped out. His shoes crunched softly against the ice. His hair, silver at the temples, was perfectly combed. He looked like he had never missed a meal in his life. He stared at them with something unreadable in his eyes. Lula squared her shoulders. "We don't need charity," she said, though her voice wavered. The man didn't respond. He just looked at Malik, shivering and pale, buried in Naya's arms. Then at Naya's frostbitten fingers, clenched in silent defiance. Finally, he spoke. "Get in," he said, voice calm but firm. "The kids are freezing." Lula hesitated. Her whole life had taught her not to trust men in suits, not to believe in sudden kindness. But Malik coughed, a thin, dry sound that twisted her insides. She nodded once. The man opened the door. Naya climbed in first, holding her brother tight. Lula followed, lowering herself slowly onto the leather seat. The warmth inside the car hit them like a wave. Lula nearly wept. The man got back in and pulled away from the curb. No one said a word for a long time. Then, quietly, Naya looked up at the man and asked, "Are you Santa Claus?" He didn't smile. His jaw clenched. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he answered, almost too softly to hear, "Not even close." And the snow kept falling. The drive was quiet. The only sound the soft hum of the heater and the occasional swish of tires cutting through snow. Outside, the world had become a monochrome blur, White sky, white trees, white streets, broken only by the amber glow of passing streetlights. James Wycliffe didn't speak. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles pale. He stole glances at the rearview mirror, where Naya sat cradling her little brother in her lap, eyes wide but alert. The older woman, Lula, sat beside them, her posture stiff, every muscle in her body still clenched in defense. They didn't trust him. He didn't blame them. "Where are we going?" Lula finally asked, her voice rough like gravel. James didn't look at her. "My house. It's just outside the city. It's warm, it's safe. That's all you need to know for now." Lula stiffened. She didn't like that answer, but her legs were still numb, and Malik hadn't coughed in the last 5 minutes, which she took as a sign that warmth was already doing its work. Naya was the first to speak again. "Why'd you stop for us?" James exhaled slowly through his nose. "I don't know," he said. But that wasn't the truth, or at least not all of it. When he had seen them, huddled together in the dark, children's eyes rimmed with frost, an old woman shielding them like a lioness, something ancient and aching had stirred inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. They reminded him of a story he'd once read to his son, a story about a family lost in a forest fighting to survive together. Back then, James had laughed at it. Life, he believed, wasn't about fairy tales. It was about building empires, winning. But tonight, none of that seemed to matter. They reached the edge of the city and passed through wrought iron gates, which opened slowly to reveal a snow-covered driveway that stretched through a grove of leafless oaks. At the end of the path stood a house. No, a mansion. Cold, modern lines of steel and glass. Beautiful in the way a blade is beautiful. Sharp, efficient, and soulless. James parked in front and stepped out. He opened the back door and offered his hand to Lula, who looked at it for a long moment before taking it. Inside, warmth and light greeted them. Motion sensor lamps blinked on as they entered. Heated floors radiated up through their feet. A grand chandelier glittered overhead like a frozen constellation. "This place is—" Naya trailed off, eyes darting from the glass staircase to the rows of untouched art along the walls. James dropped his keys in a crystal bowl and loosened his scarf. Most museums have more life. He led them to a guest room, large, tastefully furnished, with its own fireplace and ensuite bathroom. There are clean blankets in the closet, towels too. There's food in the kitchen. Help yourselves. I'll have some clothes brought in tomorrow. "You live here alone?" Lula asked. "Yes." "Why?" James didn't answer. Instead, he nodded toward the room and stepped back. "You can stay the night. No one's gonna kick you out. In the morning, we'll figure things out." He turned to leave, but Naya's voice stopped him. "Thank you, mister." James paused in the doorway. He glanced back, and for a moment, just a second, his eyes softened. "You're welcome, kid." And then he was gone. They stood there in silence for a while. The fire crackled. Malik let out a deep, warm sigh as Lula helped him into the big bed. Later, after she had washed up and changed him into dry clothes from her bag, Lula tucked both children in. She stood at the window, looking out at the long, snowy driveway, and whispered a silent prayer. Not one of hope, not yet, but maybe of possibility. Down the hall, James stood in the kitchen, hands braced against the counter. He stared into a mug of untouched coffee. His eyes were distant. Somewhere upstairs, he heard the sound of children's laughter, soft, tired, but real. He hadn't heard laughter in this house in nearly 10 years, and it terrified him. Sunlight filtered in through the floor-to-ceiling windows, soft and golden, catching in the floating dust like tiny fireflies. For the first time in weeks, the snow had stopped. The city beyond the hills glistened under the aftermath, clean, white, and deceptively calm. Naya was the first one awake. She tiptoed through the guest room, careful not to wake Malik or her grandmother. The warmth had returned to her fingers, but she still moved cautiously, as though the cold might sneak back if she made a sound. The house was quiet. Not empty, no, not like the shelter had been, but still and unfamiliar, like a new book before you turn the first page. She followed the faint smell of coffee down a hallway that seemed too long, past paintings of gray oceans and angular faces that made her feel like she didn't belong. Her feet padded silently across polished wood until she reached the kitchen. He was already there. James sat at the breakfast bar, wearing the same dark sweater from the night before. A newspaper lay open in front of him, untouched. He didn't notice her at first, or maybe he did, but chose not to react. A steaming mug sat beside him, his hands wrapped around it like he was trying to remember how warmth worked. Naya hovered in the doorway. Good morning." James looked up. His face didn't soften, but it didn't harden either. "Morning." She stepped in slowly, eyes flicking to the marble countertops, the sleek stainless steel appliances, the row of spice jars lined up like soldiers. She'd never seen a kitchen so clean that it looked unused. "Is it okay if I make toast?" "You don't have to ask," he said, setting down his mug. "Food's yours. Fridge is full. There's eggs, fruit, cereal. I think there's pancake mix, too." Naya blinked. "Pancakes?" James nodded. "You know how to make 'em?" She smiled a little, for the first time in what felt like weeks. "Yeah, my mom taught me, but we didn't have mix, just flour and stuff." There was a long pause after that. The word mom lingered between them like smoke. James rose and walked to the fridge, pulling out a carton of eggs and a jug of milk. He set them down gently on the counter. "Well, you've got mix now. Knock yourself out." Naya moved cautiously, as though afraid someone would shout at her for touching things. But as she mixed the batter, she began to hum under her breath, a tune half remembered from childhood. James watched from the stool, pretending to read the paper. In truth, he hadn't read a word. It was the humming that got to him. That small sound of a child who still remembered what it was like to be safe, or at least brave enough to pretend. Lula entered not long after, carrying Malik in her arms. The little boy's cheeks were flushed with color again, his eyes brighter. He coughed lightly, but it wasn't the desperate sound from the night before. "I didn't mean to oversleep," Lula said, clearly unsure if she needed to apologize. "The warmth." "You needed it," James replied. He needed it. Malik perked up at the smell. "Are those pancakes?" Naya grinned. "Almost." They gathered around the long kitchen island, James on one end, the three of them clustered at the other. It wasn't quite a family table, but it was something. Naya flipped the first pancake onto a plate, then poured more batter into the pan. "We usually don't eat breakfast this early," she offered, "except on Saturdays. Grandma always made eggs and grits when it was warm enough to keep the stove on." Lula's eyes twitched at the memory. "And Malik always asked for too much syrup." "Still do," Malik chimed in proudly. James gave the smallest chuckle. It surprised even him. They ate quietly after that. Pancakes passed, syrup poured, butter spread clumsily with two big knives. It was messy and imperfect and oddly alive. Halfway through her second pancake, Naya looked up. "You never told us your name." James paused, fork in hand. It was such a simple question, but it landed like a stone in still water. He hesitated. Then he said, "James." "Just James?" "James Wycliffe." Lula's fork clattered slightly against her plate. "Wycliffe? As in—" "Yes," he said shortly. "That Wycliffe." The name was everywhere. On hospitals, law firms, even the city's largest children's foundation bore it in big golden letters. Naya blinked. "Are you famous?" James let out a slow breath. "Only to people who think money is interesting." Lula gave him a look, unreadable. "Well, thank you, Mr. Wycliffe, for what you did last night. You didn't have to." He met her gaze. "No, I didn't," he said. He didn't say it with arrogance, just quiet honesty. But what surprised him more was how right it had felt. Later that morning, James stood by the fireplace in his study, watching the smoke rise. The voices in the kitchen, laughter, clinking dishes, children squabbling over syrup, drifted faintly down the hall. And for the first time in nearly a decade, this house no longer felt like a mausoleum. It felt like someone might live here again. The sun reached high over the trees, melting the thinnest layers of snow along the edges of James Wycliffe's estate. Inside, the air was still warm with the scent of breakfast and the sound of children's laughter echoing faintly from the guest wing. But James had retreated. He sat alone in his study, a room that had once held purpose but had long since become a shrine to silence. The fire crackled softly in the hearth. Books lined the walls, first editions, many unopened. A single photograph sat on the mantel above the fire. A woman with auburn curls holding a boy in a red sweater, both of them mid-laugh. The kind of laugh you couldn't fake, the kind that felt like sunlight in your chest. James stared at it without blinking. He hadn't touched that frame in 7 years. 7 years earlier. It had been Christmas Eve. Snow had fallen heavier than expected, blanketing the world in a hush. James had stayed late at the Wycliffe Foundation Gala, shaking hands with donors, making promises he never intended to keep. His wife, Claire, had called around 8, her voice tight but calm. "He wants to wait up for you." "I'll be home soon," James had said, distracted. He'd been wrong. On the way home, a delivery truck had skidded on black ice. No alcohol, no recklessness, just one mistake, one curve, one cruel twist in the road. The car had gone off the side of the bridge. They said Claire died instantly. Their son, Daniel, had survived another 2 hours. James arrived at the hospital in time to hold his hand as the boy slipped away, whispering, "Daddy's here," again and again, even as his own voice fractured. The world, for James Wycliffe, had ended in the dead of winter. He buried them both on New Year's Day beneath a stand of frozen birches. And after that, he buried himself. Back in the present, James stood and crossed the study, placing a hand on the cold glass of the window. Outside, he could see Nia dragging a sled across the snow with Malik giggling behind her. Lula sat nearby on a bench, wrapped in a thick scarf and sipping something warm. It should have been someone else out there. Someone else's boy. He had never remarried, never hosted another party, never lit the fireplace in this study until yesterday. And yet, the laughter outside wasn't a haunting echo this time. It was real. Later that afternoon, James returned to the kitchen. Nia was reading at the table, brows furrowed as she tried to understand the story in a tattered book she'd taken from his shelves. He cleared his throat. "You read a lot?" Nia looked up. "When I can. Grandma says books keep your mind warm, even when your feet are cold." James almost smiled. She's right. He walked over and poured himself a cup of tea, the silence between them less stiff than before. "Who's the boy in the picture?" Nia asked quietly, pointing to a photo she'd seen in the hall earlier, the same red sweater child. James didn't answer right away. "That was my son, Daniel." She lowered her eyes. "I'm sorry." James nodded once. "Me too." A pause. "What happened to him?" she asked, then quickly added, "You don't have to tell me." "No," James said. He sat down across from her. "It's all right." And for the first time in 7 years, he told someone the truth. Not the headlines, not the press release the family office had issued. The real story. Nia listened, her hands folded on the table, her young face serious and still. When he finished, she didn't try to comfort him or say something she thought grown-ups wanted to hear. Instead, she said, "Do you think he'd like us?" James looked at her, surprised. "What?" "Your son, Daniel. If he were still here, do you think he'd like me and Malik?" James felt something catch in his throat. "I think," he said slowly, "he would have liked you very much." That night, James stood at the foot of the grand staircase and watched Lula as she guided the children to bed. She turned back and gave him a small nod, a gesture of respect, maybe even gratitude. The house was quieter now, but not empty, not hollow. James returned to the study, sat down with a glass of brandy, and stared at the fire. The ache was still there, but it no longer consumed the room. The man who had lost a winter was still learning how to survive another. And somewhere deep inside, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, this house could hold life again. By the third morning, The house no longer echoed. It breathed. The clatter of dishes, the pitter-patter of little feet across the hardwood, the off-key melody of Naya humming while brushing her teeth, sounds once foreign to this home now began to stitch themselves into the fabric of its walls. James Wycliffe noticed it first in the quiet. The kind of quiet that wasn't empty, but full, like the hush before something beautiful happens. He'd stopped retreating to the study quite so early. Instead, he found himself lingering near the guest wing, pausing outside their door in the mornings to hear Malik's giggles or the soft, measured cadence of Lula's voice reading from one of the books she'd borrowed from the library room. It was strange how easily these strangers had settled into his home, like they had always belonged to a part of it he hadn't realized was missing. That morning, Naya sat at the kitchen table scribbling something with intense concentration. Crayons were scattered around her, along with a stack of blank printer paper she'd asked to use. James leaned against the doorway and watched silently. "You're an artist now," he asked, not unkindly. Naya looked up and smiled. "I'm designing our restaurant." "Our?" "Me, Grandma, and Malik," she said matter-of-factly. "It's going to be called the Pancake House, but fancy, like with cloth napkins and music that's not too boring." James raised an eyebrow. "And what will you serve?" "Pancakes, obviously, and grits, and hot cocoa with extra marshmallows for kids. Grandma says food tastes better when someone's waiting to eat it." James walked over and sat down beside her. "That's true." He looked at the paper. Her drawing was crude but full of intention. Little stick figures with steaming plates, a wide storefront window with a bell on the door, and above it, in bright purple crayon, the Pancake House. "She's got good instincts," James said. "Who?" Naya asked. "Your grandmother." Naya beamed. Later that day, James asked Lula to join him in the sunroom. She hesitated at first, wiping her hands on her apron. She had insisted on cleaning up breakfast, and followed him in with wary eyes. The sunroom was warm, the windows fogged slightly from the heat inside and the snow melting outside. He gestured for her to sit. "I had my assistant schedule an appointment for Malik," he began, "with a pediatrician I trust, tomorrow morning." Lula's face shifted. Pride flared, then softened into something quieter. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," he said, "but I wanted to." She studied her for a long moment. "I don't like owing people," she said finally. James leaned back. "Neither do I. So let's call it even." Lula arched an eyebrow. "Even?" He nodded. "You brought something into this house I didn't even realize I'd lost." Her lips pressed together. "You mean noise?" He chuckled. "No, I mean life." She didn't smile exactly, but her gaze softened. "You don't have to be alone, you know." James looked out the window. "Some people are just built that way." "People build walls," she said gently, "but that doesn't mean they're meant to live behind them." That night, James prepared dinner himself. He wasn't a chef, not even close, but he could follow instructions. And it had been a long time since he'd wanted to do something for someone. They ate around the kitchen island again, but this time it felt different, like something sacred had started to take root. After dinner, James found a board game in a dusty closet, sorry, still in its plastic wrapping, and suggested they play. Naya's eyes lit up. "You're going down." James gave her a look. "I was born to win." Malik declared himself the judge, though he didn't quite know the rules, and spent most of the game awarding bonus points to whoever gave him more attention. By the end of the night, they were laughing, really laughing. Lula watched James as he leaned back in his chair, eyes closed, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. She'd seen that look before, on men who'd spent too long locked away from themselves. It was the look of someone relearning how to live. Before bed, James stood again at the fireplace, alone. The photograph of Daniel and Claire still sat on the mantel. But for the first time in years, it didn't feel like an altar. He picked it up carefully, as though afraid it might break, and whispered something no one else could hear. Then he placed it back, next to a crayon drawing of the Pancake House, signed in purple by Naya Jackson. And as he turned to head upstairs, the fire behind him burned brighter. It started with a phone call. "Mr. Wycliffe?" came the voice on the other end, clipped and formal. "There's a situation I think you should be aware of." James stood by the tall window in his office, staring out at the snow-dusted drive where Malik was building a crooked snowman. Nia helped him pack the sides, while Lula supervised from a chair, bundled in one of James's thickest wool blankets. A faint trail of laughter carried through the double-paned glass. James barely looked away as he responded. "I'm listening." "There's been a report, anonymous, someone claiming there are unauthorized occupants on your estate. The police haven't acted, but a few board members are asking questions." James's jaw tensed. "Board members," he said evenly. "Since when does my private life concern the Wycliffe Foundation board?" "Well, when your name is on half the schools in the city and you house 3 unknown individuals without any public explanation, people speculate." James didn't answer. "They're worried about optics," the voice continued. "A wealthy man, reclusive, suddenly housing a black family without formal arrangements. There are narratives people might construct." James felt something cold coil in his chest, not from the snow outside, but from the icy familiarity of it all, the coded language, the polite venom, the way power was always polite until it was afraid. "I'll handle it," he said, then hung up without waiting for a reply. That evening, as they sipped hot cocoa around the fire, James, now fully initiated into the sacred tradition of extra marshmallows or it's not real, he said nothing of the call. He watched Malik tell an exaggerated story about how he and Nia had battled the snow dragon to build their snowman. James laughed, but his mind stayed distant. Lula caught it. She had the kind of eyes that saw through glass. Later, as she folded laundry in the guest room, she found him waiting just outside the door. "You okay?" she asked, her tone even. James hesitated, then stepped in, closed the door gently behind him. "They know you're here," he said. She stopped folding. "Who?" "People I work with. People who think it's odd that someone like me would take in someone like you." Lula gave him a look. "Someone like us?" James didn't look proud. "It's not about what I think, it's what they think. The neighborhood, the city, the media. This world has a way of turning kindness into suspicion." Lula set the clothes aside and stood tall, her voice calm but firm. "Then let them be suspicious." "You don't understand." "No, sir, you don't." Her eyes met his, and for the first time, James saw fire behind them. "I've raised kids in this country. I've taught classrooms full of them. I've walked into stores where people clutched their bags tighter. I've sat through job interviews where my degree meant less than the color of my skin. So, if people want to whisper about you taking us in, let them whisper. Let them howl." James didn't move. "You didn't do this for them," Lula added. "You did it because something in you cracked open, and something in us stepped through." A long silence fell between them. James nodded slowly. "They want me to send you away, quietly, before it becomes a story. And will you?" He looked at her, something solid in his voice now. "No." She studied him for a beat, then gave a small nod. "Then we'll stay," she said, "until we wear out your kindness or your pantry, whichever comes first." He smiled, just a little. "The pantry's pretty full." But the world didn't stay quiet for long. The next day, a black SUV with tinted windows idled at the gate. James didn't recognize the car, but he knew the type. When he stepped outside, the driver rolled down the window. A man in a sharp navy coat leaned over. "Mr. Wycliffe, David Langford, legal advisor to your cousin's estate." James narrowed his eyes. "My cousin doesn't own this property." "No, but there are implications regarding inheritance, family name, legacy." James didn't speak. Langford's smile was cool. "There's talk, sir, about this family you've brought into your home. No paperwork, no arrangements, and, pardon my bluntness, certain questions about motives." James stepped closer to the window. "You know what I see, Langford?" Langford blanked. "What's that?" "A man too afraid to admit that decency exists without agenda.
Langford's smile faded. James leaned in. "Let me make this clear. You have no say in what I do with my home or my life. Tell my cousin and his boardroom buzzards to find another scandal. This one's closed." And with that, he turned and walked back up the drive, snow crunching under his boots. Inside, Nia watched from the window. "Who was that man?" she asked Lula. "Just someone who doesn't understand warmth," Lula replied softly. And as the snow melted slowly from the edges of the yard, the warmth inside the house only grew stronger. But so did the eyes watching it.
The snow had returned, light and drifting, like feathers shaken loose from the sky. But inside the Wycliffe estate, it was all warmth, laughter, and the rustle of preparations. James stood in the grand dining room, staring at the long table that stretched beneath the chandelier. It hadn't been used in nearly a decade. The last time it had seen candles and laughter, Claire had been alive. Daniel had been sitting at the far end, his face sticky with cranberry sauce. Now the table sat bare, but not for long. James ran his hand over the polished wood and cleared his throat. "We'll need place settings. 4. No, 5, he corrected himself. Lula, standing in the doorway with a tray of dishes, gave him a wry look. "Are you expecting someone else?" James allowed a soft chuckle. "Maybe. A version of myself I left behind." She smiled gently. "I hope he RSVPs." By midday, the kitchen was alive with motion. Lula, apron on, took control of the stove like she was conducting a symphony. The smells of roasted vegetables, baked yams, garlic, and herbs filled the air. "Careful with those sweet potatoes," she warned. "They'll bite if you don't watch them." James had rolled up his sleeves. "Didn't know food had personalities?" "Oh, everything in this kitchen's got a soul," Lula replied, tossing a spoon at him. "Even you, Mr. Billionaire." Malik sat on the counter, helping Naya press cookie dough into shapes. Snowmen, stars, lopsided bells. They were imperfect, but joyful, like fingerprints on a stained glass window. "Do you think Santa will find us here?" Malik asked. Naya nodded. "Definitely. This house probably has Wi-Fi for reindeer." James looked up from peeling carrots. "Pretty sure I installed that last year." The children laughed, and for a moment it was as if the walls of the house exhaled. That evening, James lit the candles himself. 5 flickering flames reflected on the silver cutlery and glass goblets. He'd chosen wine from a cellar he hadn't touched in years. For the children, sparkling cider in tall glasses, because tradition mattered, even if the rules had changed. Everyone was dressed nicely. Malik wore a little sweater vest over his collared shirt. Naya in a deep blue dress that Lula had stitched from one of James's old cashmere sweaters. "You clean up well, sir," Lula said as he entered in a tailored navy suit and no tie. He glanced at her, then at the table. "This feels like something." She nodded. "It is." They sat, James at the head of the table where no one had sat since Claire, and the others spread out naturally. For a moment, silence returned, the good kind. Then Malik stood up on his chair. "We have to say what we're thankful for," he announced. James smiled. "That's for Thanksgiving." "I didn't get to do it then." Lula gestured. "Well, go ahead then, preacher." Malik put his hands behind his back and said solemnly, "I'm thankful for pancakes and snow and my sister and Grandma and this house and Mr. James, who is not Santa Claus but maybe a cousin." Everyone laughed. Then Naya spoke. "I'm thankful for warm beds and warm food, and for people who do things even when they don't have to." Lula looked at her, eyes misting slightly. James swallowed. "And you?" Lula asked him, gently. He looked down the table, at the food, at the small hands gripping forks, at the softness in Lula's smile, at the life that had returned to these walls. He spoke slowly. "I'm thankful for second chances, even the ones that show up in the snow." After dinner, they moved to the fireplace. The tree had been set up that afternoon. Naya had insisted, dragging in boxes from the storage room with Malik as her little helper. They decorated it with James's old ornaments, some dusty, some broken, some made of memories he'd buried too deep.
There was one ornament, fragile glass, hand-painted, that had belonged to Daniel. A silver star with his initials on the back. It fell from Malik's hands as he tried to hang it. The room froze. The star shattered against the hardwood floor. I didn't mean to," Malik cried, eyes wide with panic. James knelt down slowly. He picked up a jagged piece of the ornament and stared at it for a long, quiet moment. Then, gently, he placed it in Malik's hands. "It's okay," he said. "It was already cracked, just like me." Malik looked up at him, confused. But Naya understood. So did Lula. James stood and placed his hand on Malik's shoulder. "We can make a new one tomorrow," he said. That night, after the children were asleep, James stood by the tree with Lula. "You did something tonight," she said softly. "What's that?" "You let them love you." He was quiet. "It scared you, didn't it?" she added. He nodded. "Good," she said. "Means you're alive again." James exhaled, a long, deep breath that felt like it had been trapped in him for years. "Merry Christmas, Lula. Merry Christmas, James." Outside, snow fell softly again. Inside, 5 stockings hung over the fireplace, 4 with names and 1 blank. Tomorrow, James would write on it. Tonight, he let it hang there, silent, expectant, full of something like hope.
It began with a knock. Not a firm, grown-up kind of knock, but a knock made with small fingers, uncertain and hopeful. James opened his bedroom door and found Malik standing there in his pajamas, a plush bear tucked under one arm and snowman slippers slightly crooked on his feet. "Can I ask you something?" Malik whispered. James knelt. "Of course." "Can I call you Uncle James? I know you're not really my uncle, but I heard Grandma say sometimes families aren't always about whose blood, they're about who stays." James blinked. For a moment, words abandoned him. Then, with a voice husky from emotion, he said, "I'd be honored, Malik." Malik beamed and hugged him around the neck. James hadn't realized he was crying until Malik's little hand gently patted his cheek. "It's okay," the boy said. "Sometimes I cry when I'm really happy too." The next morning, James woke to sunlight. Not just the usual pale winter light, but something brighter, sharper, like the sun had finally remembered how to shine. Downstairs, Lula was humming an old gospel tune. The smell of cornbread and fried apples filled the kitchen. "You're smiling," she noted as he entered. James paused. "Am I?" She gestured with her spatula. "You should do that more often. Makes you look less like someone who's been arguing with ghosts." He gave a short laugh. "Maybe I have." "Then let the ghosts rest, hummy," she said, plating a hot slice of cornbread. "We've got living to do." Later that day, James stood outside with Nia and Malik as they slid down the long hill beside the house. The snow was fresh, but the air was warmer now, crisp, not biting. Nia whooshed past him on a sled, hair flying behind her like a superhero's cape. "Did you see that?" she shouted. "I'm faster than light." Malik, waiting his turn, turned to James and said, "You should try." James raised an eyebrow. "I haven't been on a sled since—" But before he could finish, Nia was dragging the sled back up to him. "Come on," she grinned. "You only live once." James hesitated, then sat down awkwardly, knees tucked up, clearly unpracticed. Nia gave him a big push. The sled flew. James shouted, not out of fear, but out of sheer disbelief. The world blurred with wind and snow. For a moment, he felt exactly like Daniel used to, laughing down the hill in his red jacket. When the sled finally slowed to a stop, James sat still, laughing breathlessly. Not a polite chuckle, not a quiet smile, a real laugh, the kind that rose from somewhere deep and clean. Up on the hill, Nia and Malik cheered. Lula peeked through the window, wiping her hands on a towel, her face glowing with something close to pride. That night, around the fire, James told them a story. Not a business story, not a polite dinner anecdote, a real story. About Daniel, about Claire, about a Christmas Eve years ago when their car broke down in the middle of nowhere and they spent the night in a gas station drinking vending machine cocoa and playing cards with strangers. "How did you win?" Malik asked. James smiled. "Your Aunt Claire cheated. Beautifully."
They laughed, and James felt the old pain lose some of its bite. "You miss her a lot," Nia said quietly. "I do," James said, "but tonight I think she'd be glad I found you." The children didn't speak, but they leaned closer, curling against him like puzzle pieces falling into place. Later, after they'd all gone to bed, James walked the house slowly. He touched the photos on the wall, the ones he'd avoided for years. He paused before one of Daniel, holding a tiny model airplane, missing his 2 front teeth. He whispered, "I hope you'd be proud of me, kiddo." The silence around him didn't answer, but it felt warmer somehow. Not empty, just still. In the study, James opened his laptop. He hadn't used it in days. Emails had piled up, press requests, interviews, a message from the board. He began typing. "To whom it may concern, thank you for your concern about my personal affairs. The guests in my home are not guests. They are family. I will not be entertaining further questions on this matter. Kind regards, James Wycliffe." He hit send. Then he closed the laptop and left it there, untouched. That night, as snow fell softly once more, James dreamed for the first time in years. He dreamed of laughter, and when he woke, the echo of it remained.
The snow had slowed, and in its wake, the sky revealed a pale winter sun. It lit the halls of the Wycliffe estate with an amber softness, and dust motes danced in its rays like forgotten memories stirring. James sat alone in the study, a mug of Lula's strong coffee in one hand, the other resting absently on the edge of his mahogany desk. The children were outside making snow angels. He could hear their laughter through the glass, sharp, joyful, echoing like bells through the cold. It made him ache in a strange and beautiful way. He turned to the drawer on the left, one he hadn't opened in years. The bottom drawer, the one that stuck a little because the wood had swollen. He hadn't dared to open it since Claire's funeral, since Daniel. His hand hovered over the brass handle for a long while. Then he pulled. Dust rose. Inside were yellowing documents, scattered receipts, an old cigar box, and beneath it all, a small leather photo album. James drew it out slowly, as if it might break apart. He opened to the first page. Claire, smiling in the kitchen, flour on her nose, holding a wooden spoon like a sword. Next page. Daniel, just 3 years old, asleep on James's chest, a toy train in one hand. James smiled without realizing it. He flipped further. Photos of vacations, family dinners, a blurry snapshot of Daniel's 7th birthday, frosting all over his face. Then he stopped. Tucked between 2 pages, almost forgotten, was a Polaroid. Not posed, not framed. Just a quiet moment captured in fading color. James was sitting on the floor in the living room, his head thrown back in laughter. Daniel sat in his lap, clutching a comic book. Claire was off to the side, mid-sentence, caught with her mouth open and her hands mid-gesture. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. It felt like home. James stared at the photo for a long time. Then he whispered, "I'd forgotten what I looked like when I was happy." That afternoon, he called Naya and Malik inside. "I have something to show you," he said, leading them into the study. He placed the Polaroid on the desk between them. "Is that you?" Naya asked. James nodded. "And that's Daniel?" Malik whispered. "Yes." "Who's the pretty lady?" Naya added. "That's Claire, my wife." They stared at the photo in silence. "She looks kind," Naya said. "She was," James replied. "Do you miss her?" Malik asked. "Every day," James said quietly. "But I think she'd like you." Naya picked up the photo gently. "You should put it in a frame." James smiled. "You're right." The 3 of them went into town that evening. Main Street was glowing with string lights and garlands. A small framing shop stood on the corner, tucked between a used bookstore and a bakery. The woman behind the counter, gray-haired, soft-spoken, took the photo with careful hands. "This one means a lot to you," she said, more a statement than a question. James nodded. She showed them frame options. Naya chose a warm walnut with gold edges. Matches the photo, she said. They waited as the woman mounted it with care. When she handed it back, something shifted in James's chest. The past didn't feel as sharp anymore. It felt like a thread, still attached to something important. Back at the house, James placed the framed photo on the mantel, right above the fireplace, between the stockings. Not in a place of mourning, but where it could watch over the laughter, the games, the family dinners to come. That night, Lula stood beside him, arms crossed. "I never thought I'd see the day," she asked. "What day is that?" he asked. "You letting the past sit with the present." James looked at the photo, at Claire, mid-gesture, at Daniel grinning in his lap. "They belong together," he said. Lula nodded. "So do you." Later, after the children had gone to bed, James found himself humming. He didn't realize it at first. A soft tune, one Claire used to sing while folding laundry. He didn't remember the words, but the melody rose in him like smoke from a warm chimney. A sound that meant something, something soft, something alive, something healing. Outside, the night was still, but inside, something long frozen had started to thaw. A man who once kept his memories buried now let them breathe. And with each breath, his heart remembered how to laugh.
The storm didn't come with snow. It came with headlines. James Wycliffe hadn't looked at the news in nearly 2 weeks. He hadn't needed to. His world had shrunk in the best way possible, into warm breakfasts, snow angels, late-night stories, and cocoa-stained laughter. But the storm found him anyway. It arrived in the form of a knock at the front door. Lula opened it. 3 men stood on the porch, coats sharp, boots clean, expressions cold. One held a tablet. "We're looking for Mr. Wycliffe," he said. James appeared behind her, calm but wary. "That's me." "I'm Douglas Kearns," the man replied, extending a hand James didn't shake. "Public liaison for Wycliffe Industries. We've come regarding the article in the Beacon." James didn't blank. "I haven't read it." "You should," the man said. "They've published photos of you sledding with the children. Some commentary. Speculation." "Speculation?" James repeated, his voice cooling. "Yes, sir. About the nature of your relationship with the children, and questions about your mental health following your son's passing." Lula stepped forward, fire in her eyes. "Excuse me?" Kearns didn't look at her. He continued, addressing only James. "The board is concerned. They're asking whether your recent actions reflect a significant change in behavior. Some shareholders are calling it a crisis of image." James stared at him for a long time. "You came to my home," he said quietly, "to ask if I've gone insane for showing kindness to children who needed shelter?" "We came to offer guidance," Kearns replied. "There's a suggested public statement, clarifying that this arrangement is temporary, that you're not adopting them or—" "I never said it was temporary," James cut in. That silenced the man for a moment. James stepped closer, his voice firm now. "Tell the board this. I'm not abandoning those children to make my portfolio look cleaner. If they want to remove me, let them vote. Until then, get off my porch." He closed the door, hard. Inside, the house was quiet. Nia stood at the top of the stairs, Malik beside her. They had heard everything. "Are they going to take us away?" Nia asked, voice trembling. James looked up at her, every line in his face softening. "No one's taking you anywhere." "But if they make you choose," Malik said, "between your company and us?" James knelt down, arms open. "Then I choose you." Nia rushed into him first, wrapping her arms around his neck. Malik followed, small and shivering, his fingers twisting in James's sweater. Upstairs, Lula quietly closed her eyes. She had heard many kinds of promises in her life, but that one, it rang true. The next morning, the story had gone viral. #Billionaire with a heart trended alongside #Wycliffe scandal. Opinions split down the middle, some condemning him as unstable, others praising his courage. But one voice pierced through the noise. A letter from a woman in Detroit. "Dear Mr. Wycliffe,
I'm a single mother of two. When I read what you did, inviting those children in during the storm, I wept. Because once, when I was 8, someone did that for me, and it changed everything. Please, don't let the world talk you out of compassion. The world needs more men like you. Sincerely, Rhonda T. James printed it out and taped it on the fridge. When Malik asked why, James said, "Because sometimes the truth whispers louder than the headlines." That evening, they sat around the fireplace again. The snow had started falling once more, but inside, the fire glowed strong. "I think," James said slowly, "that maybe storms don't come just to break us. Sometimes they come to test what we've built." "Did we pass?" Nia asked. James looked up at her, at Malik, at Lula, at the photo of Daniel and Claire now framed above the mantel. "Yes," he said, "we passed." And when he said it, he knew it was true. The storm could come again, but this time they would face it together.
The door hadn't been opened in years. It stood at the farthest end of the second-floor hallway, oak wood, white-trimmed, silent. The hinges no longer squeaked because no one had dared to disturb them. No light bled from beneath it, no drafts slipped through the frame. It had become part of the house, like a bone buried deep and long forgotten. Daniel's room. For a long time, James had passed it without looking. Sometimes, when memory flared too hot, he avoided that hallway entirely. But now, something was different. Malik had asked the night before if there was a room with a window that sees the stars. James hadn't answered right away, but as he lay awake that night, he remembered the skylight in Daniel's room, the one they'd installed just before his 8th birthday. To Daniel, it was his telescope to heaven. Now, maybe it was time for someone else to look through it. The next morning, James stood before the door. His hand hovered over the knob. Lula appeared silently at his side. "You sure?" she asked. "No," he said, "but I think that's why I have to." He turned the handle. The door opened. Dust hung in the air like a whisper. Light poured in from the skylight, soft and golden, catching on a shelf of model rockets, a faded poster of planets, and a small twin bed with a navy blanket folded at the foot. Everything was just as Daniel had left it. The room didn't smell of death or sorrow. It smelled like boyhood, curiosity, hope. James stepped inside. He ran his fingers across the desk where Daniel had drawn pictures of spaceships and scribbled homework in uneven handwriting. A baseball glove still hung from the corner of the bookshelf. The last book Daniel had read, The Little Prince, lay on the nightstand, a corner folded. James sat on the bed. The weight of grief didn't crush him as he'd expected. Instead, something else settled in, like a reunion. Like he'd finally returned to a place that had been waiting for him. He found Nia and Malik in the kitchen, helping Lula knead dough. "You still want that room with a window to the stars?" James asked. Malik nodded quickly. James smiled. "Come with me." They climbed the stairs together, James in front, Nia and Malik behind. At the end of the hall, he pushed the door open and stepped aside. "This was my son's room," James said quietly. The children paused, respectful. "He loved space," murmured, spotting the planets on the wall. "He said the stars made him feel less lonely," James said. Malik moved to the window and looked up through the skylight. "You can see Orion," he whispered. Nia walked to the shelf of model rockets. "Did he build all these?" James nodded. She touched one gently. "He was smart." "He was also kind," James said, "like you." Later that evening, James and Lula began clearing out the room, not erasing Daniel, but making space. James packed away some of the toys, setting aside the ones that felt too personal. He left the planets and the books. He changed the sheets, fluffed the pillows. They painted the walls with Malik's help. He chose a deep starry blue. Nia picked a soft gold rug and helped string fairy lights along the bookshelves. Malik placed Daniel's favorite rocket on the nightstand. "I think he'd want it to stay," he said. James said nothing, but his eyes grew glassy. That night, Malik slept beneath the skylight. James tucked him in and sat on the edge of the bed. "Why are stars so far away?" Malik asked. "So we can look up," James replied. "Do you think Daniel can see me from up there?" "I do." Malik smiled, eyes heavy. "Then maybe I'll wave sometimes." "You should," James whispered. As Malik drifted to sleep, James looked around the room. For the first time in years, it didn't feel frozen. It felt lived in, loved, alive. The next morning, a small wooden sign hung on the door. It read, "The Room of Stars, for dreamers only." James left it there. Because dreams deserved a place in this house, and so did healing.
It was Lula who found it. She was sorting through old linens in the attic, searching for extra blankets. The winter outside still hadn't let up, and though the fireplace kept them warm, there was something about an extra quilt on the bed that made everything feel safer. The box sat in the corner, labeled in Claire's neat handwriting, "Daniel, School and Drawings, do not throw out." She opened it slowly, not to intrude, but to remember. Inside were folders of drawings, science fair ribbons, a third-grade essay titled "Why I Want to be an Astronaut," and near the bottom, an envelope. It had yellowed with time. Scrawled across the front in the shaky penmanship of a child were the words, "To Daddy, open if you're ever really sad." Lula froze. She stared at the envelope as if it might vanish. She climbed down from the attic like someone carrying treasure and found James in the sunroom, a book in his lap, his glasses halfway down his nose. "I found something," she said quietly. He looked up and saw the envelope. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then he set the book aside, took the letter in both hands, and held it to his chest before slowly opening it. Inside was a single sheet of notebook paper. It read, "Dear Daddy, if you're opening this, then maybe I'm not there, or maybe I just made you sad again. I want to say something important. I'm not afraid of space. You told me once that people think it's scary because it's dark and cold and quiet, but I don't think so. I think it's like God's pocket, like He keeps everything safe there. So if I ever go away, you don't have to worry. I'll still be somewhere. I'll still love you. I hope you find someone to laugh with again, someone who likes pancakes and snow and dumb knock-knock jokes. Maybe even some kids who need a dad. You're good at being one. Love, Daniel. P.S. Tell Mom I said she's still the boss." James didn't cry right away. He just sat there, the paper trembling in his hands. Then came the tears, quiet, slow, grateful. Lula sat beside him, her hand gently resting on his. Neither spoke. There was nothing to add to such a letter. That evening, James called Naya and Malik into the living room. "I want to show you something," he said. They sat on either side of him as he unfolded the letter and began to read it aloud. When he finished, the silence was not heavy, but sacred. Naya wiped her eyes. "He sounds like he was really funny." "He was," James smiled. Malik looked down. "I'm not trying to replace him." James placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "You aren't. No one could. But you're adding something he would have loved." Naya leaned her head against James's arm. "Do you think he knew about us?" "I think," James softly, "he hoped I'd find you." Later that night, they framed the letter and placed it above the desk in Malik's room. Malik called it the compass. Because sometimes when you're lost, the kindest thing is a voice reminding you where home is. In the kitchen, Lula poured hot cocoa into 3 mugs. "One for the past," she said, handing James the first. "One for the present," she handed one to Malik. "And one for the future," she gave the last to Naya. They clinked mugs together, and for the first time since winter began, James realized something extraordinary. His house had stopped echoing. It no longer mourned the silence. It hummed with life. The snow finally stopped. It had fallen for weeks, sometimes gently, sometimes with fury, blanketing the city in white silence. But this morning, as the sun rose behind bare branches and icy roofs, it cast a soft gold over everything. The clouds had parted. The world, though cold, no longer felt frozen. James stood at the window of the study, coffee in hand, gazing out at the driveway.
He watched as Malik tried to teach Lula how to throw a snowball properly. Nia coached them both, arms crossed like a tiny general. The laughter that rose from the yard didn't echo. It simply filled the house. He smiled and turned back to his desk. On the surface lay a document, official, thick, weighty. Adoption papers. He had already signed them. Now they waited only for Nia and Malik. It wasn't that simple, of course. James had spoken to a lawyer. He'd spoken to Lula. And most importantly, he'd sat down with Nia one quiet evening while Malik was asleep and asked the hardest question of all. Do you want to stay? Nia hadn't answered right away. She'd looked down at her hands. I don't want to leave, she said finally, but I'm scared. Of what? That this will disappear, that you'll change your mind, that people like us don't get to have people like you. James reached across the table and took her hand. Nia, he said gently, I don't want to save you. I want to walk beside you. And I want you and Malik to save me too, if I'm being honest. She blinked back tears. Okay, she whispered. Then yes, we want to stay. They signed the papers together, 3 pens moving slowly, reverently, as though each stroke of ink rewrote something old inside of them. The lawyer submitted them the next day. The process would take months, but none of them minded. The hard part was already done. They were a family now. Everything else was just paperwork. Lula decided to stay too. Not forever, she said, just long enough to teach James how to cook something besides toast. She brought with her the warmth of a woman who had lived through too much and lost too much, but still chose kindness. One morning, while planting spring bulbs in the backyard, she said to James, "You're not fixing them, you're making room for them to grow." He looked at her hands, worn and steady, pressing tulip bulbs into the earth. "And what are you doing?" he asked. "Building a garden out of ashes." The days began to lengthen. Malik started school in the spring. He brought home drawings of stars and stories about a teacher who looked like Mrs. Claus but rapped on the desk like a drummer. Nia enrolled in a nearby community college. She wanted to become a nurse. "I want to be the kind of person who shows up when it hurts," she said. James couldn't think of a better reason. He started opening the house again, room by room. He invited neighbors for tea. He walked through the city with Malik on Saturdays. They visited the library, the museum, the park where Claire used to read poetry under the big oak. And one afternoon, under that same tree, James stood with Nia, Malik, and Lula, each holding a flower. They scattered petals in the wind and spoke Daniel's name. Not with pain, with joy, with remembrance, with love. Spring came at last. The garden behind the house bloomed in shy yellows and bold purples, tulips, daffodils, and something Lula called laughing violets. The sign on the front porch was new, burned into the wood by hand. The Lambert House, where hope sleeps in and wakes up hungry. Every evening, they ate together at the same table, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Because here, in the house that once knew only silence and grief, something deeper had taken root. Not just healing, not just forgiveness, but belonging. And if you were to walk past on a warm spring evening, you might hear music through the open windows, or the sound of Malik's laughter echoing down the stairs, or Nia singing to herself in the kitchen. And maybe, just maybe, you'd see James on the porch, sipping tea, eyes toward the stars. Because once, in the middle of winter, he opened his door to a stranger and found a home waiting inside.